going on, everyone? Welcome back to another edition of Respect the Craft. This is episode number 260, and I truly have the biggest honor here of getting to speak to a true legend of the business. He is a multi-time tag team champion, true specialist of the game, current wrestling revolver heavyweight champion, Mr. Alex Shelley. Good morning, sir. How's it going?
Oh, good morning to you too. Thanks for having me.
No, thank you. Thank you so much. Before we get into all the questions, I do want to ask you here. You heard the name of the show. It's called Respect the Craft. So I have to ask you, when you hear that term for you, when you hear the term the craft, what does that mean to you?
Oh man, that's a good question. I was brought in by a generation of wrestlers who I feel like were quite old school, and my generation, which debuted in either the late '90s or the early aughts, had very different standards we had to abide by. And it was still very much in a phase of protecting the business in a lot of ways. And I have a great affinity for that. So for me, there's these different uh, intrinsic moral codes that I abide by for pro wrestling. And of course, society and wrestling changes as we go through the years, and that's to be expected. At the same time, there's so many lessons to be learned from our history, whether that's in this industry or just humanity. And if I can introduce any of those lessons to people who are younger than me, especially because I'm 41 and I can still wrestle at a pretty high level with people 10 to 20 years younger than me, then I feel like it's my obligation to do so, because I had some really, really awesome mentors. Robbie Brookside, Sabu, Kevin Nash, Mick Foley, Scott D'Amore, and these guys, again, they were brought up in the 80s and the 90s, and it was a totally different industry.
No, that's perfect. And definitely, again, it's an ever changing business. And
Yeah.
like you said, you're still going at it like it's aging like fine wine. You haven't missed a beat. And it's a pleasure to be able to speak with you here. But talking about that again, talking about that time, I want to ask you this: being a part of such influential factions slash teams like the Embassy, Generation Next, Paparazzi Productions, the Motor City Machine Guns, the Time Splitters. Can you tell us a little bit about how those teams slash factions molded the performer we see today?
Oh, sure. So I almost forget that I've been able to team with so many people. And if I kind of run down quickly my list of
Yeah,
tag partners, obviously it's Saban and Kushida, which both of those teams were uh, very obviously formed in Japan.
yeah,
Time I've been fortunate enough to team with Jimmy Rave, Roderick Strong, Abyss, multiple times, right, with these guys. And I think I was able to draw something off of each situation, because what was called for as far as my role was very different in each of those teams. But to me, tag team wrestling is an absolute art form. And I wouldn't say that tag team wrestling is dying, because that's not the case. But I feel like it's gone very much in one direction as far as how it's being done.
gotcha.
And just so many ways to cook that dish. Uh, there's so much great tag team wrestling out there for people to get a hold of and study, that the more they can broaden their horizons, the better off that particular aspect of pro wrestling is going to be.
Got you. When it comes to that as well, was that something you ever thought getting into the business that was going to be your direction? Again, you're part of some of the greatest tag teams, especially the Machine Guns. Was that something that you thought that was going to be your direction, or was it more of just it fell in the cards when it came into your direction?
I always loved tag team wrestling. So that should be stated. When I was growing up, it was tag teams who basically looked like carbon copies of one another, or it was what you see more of today, where it's like two established superstars put together in a
Gotcha.
team. But I never suspected that I would be a tag team specialist.
Gotcha.
That was never anything I was opposed to either. But at the
Okay.
same, nothing I really thought of, and it just so happened to work out that way. And I think what really kind of opened my mind to tag wrestling on the whole was when I was 21, and I started going to Japan. I realized very quickly that the touring system saved the big singles matches and the big tag matches for the biggest shows. But when you were in the country towns, you basically did 6 mans, 8 mans, 10 mans, or tag team matches with nonlinear partners. And for about oh man, at least a solid year plus, from 2005 to 2006, I was on every Zero One Max tour and teaming with some really incredible wrestlers. And some of these guys are my friends, like Brian Kendrick, Sanjay Dutt, Steve Carino. But a lot of them were Japanese legends too. So I might be on the same team as Masato Tanaka. I might be on the same team as Shinjiro Otani. And again, these weren't straight tag matches. So I got that
Yep.
experience of having these multi-man matches a lot more very early on in my career. And that was when I started to realize, oh, wow, this is something that can actually have a totally different pace and a totally different set of challenges. And as somebody who rather consistently just kind of wants to learn more, that's just in my nature, uh, it was something new that I could try to master, which invariably ended up to me bringing Chris Sabin to 0-1 and us winning our first set of titles.
How'd you know? And again, it was great that that transition not only from Japan, then being brought over to the States. Again, one of the most spoke about tag teams when it comes to our generation of wrestling as well. Speaking for
Thanks.
myself, especially that generation of just growing up on you guys and seeing the amazing things you guys even continue to do, even to this day, that we're going to talk about in just a little bit. But I do want to circle back to one of the teams I brought up, or factions, I should say, and that was the Embassy, because I know you had a great friendship as well with the crown jewel of the Embassy, the late great himself, Jimmy Rave. Can you talk us through a little bit about that friendship and what you learned with your time with Jimmy?
Yeah, absolutely. Jimmy was the man. Jimmy and I were both kind of like the youngest in our generation, right?
Gotcha.
So in our generation, we had Punk, Command the Hero, BJ Whitmer, like those were the guys who directly influenced me because I was raised in IWA Mid South. And then when we got to Ring of Honor, there were a lot of East Coast guys who were very good, who were much older than us. So your Low Keys, your Homicides, the Backseat Boys, people like that. And Jimmy, when I first met him, was I believe we were the same age. No, he was a little bit older than me, but by months, not years.
Gotcha.
But we were both 19, and I had already seen so much of his work because he had just kind of exploded on TNA and NWA Wildside, done all this cool stuff. I really looked up to Jimmy, and we became friends in the locker room just based off of love of pro wrestling, but also being the youngest guys. And eventually, we ended up in Ring of Honor together, and it was Gabe's idea to turn me heel and put me with Jimmy. And it was a natural fit because that was what, 2006, about there. And we had already been friends for about 3 years, but we did all these shows together. And he was kind of the first person that I didn't know locally in the Metro Detroit area that wasn't PD, Jimmy Jacobs, or Saban, that I was on shows with all the time, like every weekend. And it was because I was fortunate enough at a young age to be working for these higher profile companies. So I might see him at IWA Mid South, and then the next weekend I might see him at Ring of Honor, and then the next weekend we'd be at the airport together for CZW. And the more you're around people in these environments, closer your bond becomes. But again, we just had so much in common. And being that young, 19, 20, 21, we just loved wrestling so much. Not that we don't love it now, but it changes as you grow, as it should.
No, definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yep. And that was more or less the beginning of our bond. And what you saw with the Embassy, as far as like how some people consider it very entertaining, that was mainly because of how comfortable we were with one another. And we really did love each other very much.
No, that's amazing to hear. And Jimmy was someone, luckily, I was able to work under Capital Wrestling / Catalyst Wrestling that you got to work for in the last 2 years. And it was something of just getting to pick his brain for a while. It was always a fountain of knowledge. Such an amazing person, always
Yeah,
kind hearted.
he was great.
So from there, I do want to talk about we in the introduction we said it. You are currently the reigning and defending wrestling revolver heavyweight champion with a huge matchup coming up at Cage of Horrors next week. Being that it will be this matchup right here, as you'll be defending against Speedball Mike Bailey, even a match that you've said is possibly one of the biggest tests yet for that championship that you have. Can you talk us through a little bit about that and what this match means here with Speedball?
Oh man, I think Speedball's just I can't put into words how highly I value him and how much respect I have for the guy. Being a part of Revolver is incredible in its own right. And the trust that's been put in me to have all these title shots and carry these titles as I have for a couple of years now has been something that I don't take lightly. It's a very, very special company. It very much reminds me of like this generation's ECW in many ways. And I think Speedball, I mean, pound for pound might be the best out there right now. That's not in WWE or AEW. I just can't put into words how hard he works and the sacrifices he's made for pro wrestling. And even if I hate to say it this way, even if somebody wasn't good, good by somebody's standards, I'd still have so much respect for them just based on the sacrifices, right? It's like, man, you really wanted this. You really went for it. You really tried. And the fact that he's just as skilled as he is and humble about it and open to learning more is just why he's what he is. A few years ago, we had a match for Impact, now TNA. And it was right when I came back to the company. It was WrestleMania weekend, and I think they really just kind of needed an opponent for him. So they brought me in last minute, and I hadn't signed a contract with them. I was still working 40 hours a week in PT and doing all these indies all over the place. And we had what I felt was a really awesome match. And afterwards, I always look to the generations before me for feedback and advice, right? Because honestly, it's cool. Like, it's cool for me to have these guys that I grew up watching give me their thoughts on things. And Tommy Dreamer and D'Lo Brown were backstage and really, really enjoyed what we had done. And I remember Tommy looking at both of us and saying, "You are the older version of him," and looking at Speedball and saying, "You will become him. So pick his brain now and figure out how he does things." And I was so flattered by that, because it's not just him picking my brain. It's a symbiosis. And it's one that I really don't have with too many people out there right now. But I do have it with Speedball. And I have it with a couple other guys too, like Gresham and Saban and Kushida. But Speedball especially. And we very much ping pong off each other in terms of abstract thinking and how we do things. And he's just the fucking best. And if you haven't seen him live, like, it's a different ball game. So, like, definitely come out to this show. Definitely check it out.
There you go. Definitely. Again, that will be next Saturday. Ladies and gentlemen, check it out. It will be Cage of Horrors, a stacked event. It's shaping up to be one of the biggest and craziest Revolver events yet. But from there, I do have to talk about it because it's one of those that I know everyone is waiting for. And that is to talk about this pairing right here with you and Saban. And like I said, truly one of the most influential and just best tag teams, especially of my generation here. One of the favorite matches I can bring up is you guys versus Team 3D at Turning Point.
Oh,
That I
thanks.
felt like is one of those that is just it always just, especially what it meant, just every moment in that match, all that. For you guys, what was that? Just seeing what it became, because I can imagine we were thinking of the first pairing going to Japan and then finally bringing it over to the States. Was it something that you would ever think it would be as influential and something that till this day it's like a lot of people telling you guys, hey, you guys inspired us to want to be wrestlers or be a part of the business like this?
Yeah, no, I it still shocks me when I hear it.
Yeah.
And I'm not a person who like looks back retroactively. That's just not my nature.
Gotcha.
I don't really like consider things I've done because, for better or worse, I'm always focusing on the next thing, right? Like, I'm always focusing on new things, whether they're wrestling related or not these days. And I love to learn, right? So we learned tag team wrestling, and it was a struggle for us to get the Machine Guns formed in TNA, believe it or not. But we did have the willingness of these older tag teams who had been established wanting to work with us. And it was mainly the Dudleys, Team 3D, and the New Age Outlaws. Both those teams like really wanted to be in the ring with us, which was massive. And we learned so much. Like, I learned so much from Road Dogg and Billy Gunn over the course of a few matches, and I learned even more from Bubba and Devon because we were married to them for a little bit. And we wouldn't be the team we are without them. I wouldn't be the wrestler I am without them, because it was just different situations, right? And to me, wrestling is a lot like math, in the sense that while math is completely objective based, you can get to the correct answer, and there's really no correct answer in pro wrestling. You have to almost make mistakes. You have to be put in uncomfortable situations and figure it out, and figure out what works and what didn't work. Like, what was flawed in that equation that led to you not getting the right answer, or who explained the parts of the equation that you had no idea what the variable meant. And 3D did that for us, because we had these tables matches and ladder matches and brawls and wrestling matches. And it was like, okay, cool. Like, this makes more sense now, right? So having that experience, which teams now, younger teams now, there aren't really teams like that for them to learn from. Like, there aren't these teams that necessarily made millions of dollars in WWE for them to just sit under the learning tree of. And that sucks. Uh, you look at the teams from our generation that really killed it, and obviously the Bucks, right? So much so they have their own company, which is awesome. The Briscoes, and us. And that was kind of like more or less what it was, for the longest, as far as teams that were like still actively competing. And you know, you can only work two of those three teams now, and FTR is very good too, and that's probably the closest derivative from a WWE standpoint that you can go learn from, to learn that style. And they opt for a old school style too, right? So it's almost like, man, I wish the New Age Outlaws were still around for people to wrestle. I wish 3D was still around for people to wrestle, because we just benefited so much from that.
And I feel like that's become a lot of times now for you guys, like a lot of people wanting that as a part of almost everyone's dream list of wanting to face the machine guns.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. I think
Yeah.
the downside is you have a lot of people trying to wrestle the way we wrestled too.
That
And
yeah.
the style that we wrestled was born out of necessity and our artistic minds, right? But doing what we do, or trying to do what we do, may work, but maybe that's not the best approach, right? Just
Right.
because you have a favorite wrestler doesn't mean that you necessarily should try to wrestle like them. Maybe, maybe not. And really, what you should do, in my opinion, is work to your athletic ability, work to what you're capable of doing, and work to what's different or what's not being offered currently. Because pro wrestlers and what we do in the ring are ultimately a product. And if the market's saturated with a certain product, odds are we don't need more of it. But I think what's happened is we drew off a certain style and generation of tag team wrestling. And of course, people today are doing the same thing. But man, I think they'd be better served to go back like a couple more generations and watch the Midnight Express and watch the Fantastics and see exactly where the beats are, or how they went into certain things. And then watch the tag teams from the 90s and see how they do it too. But it's like, it's almost like it's a viewpoint of back 15 to 20 years and then no more than that. It's like, no, dig deeper, especially now with the advantage of being able to do so quite easily, like
No, yeah, there's such an advantage now of being able to search things up and being able to see things that even maybe for your generation couldn't as easily find as it
definitely.
is now. That it's like it's a YouTube search of being able to see these amazing moments and matches. That it's like tape study is a lot easier and a lot more just on your phone now at this point.
Yeah, we were fortunate enough to have Jim Cornette as our coach for a little while too.
Yeah,
He was NA, and he wanted us to work like the Midnight Express, which was a huge honor. So he actually gave us a study packet, and man, we picked that thing apart. Like,
yeah.
we went through it, and then he was there every other week for us to give questions to, and he helped us just so much with like how they would do it and what to emphasize, what not to emphasize. And not everybody's going to get these opportunities, but there's just so much cool stuff out there that people aren't watching if they're wrestlers, and really probably if they're fans too. It's like, if you're sick of whatever's being offered up in a certain company, like, that's okay. There's so much wrestling, like,
No, yeah, there definitely is. There's so much that again you're able to find something in this great world of wrestling. But
right.
again, now with that pairing and just again the chemistry that you two have, what does it feel like facing off once again this coming July for this stacked event for Prestige right here?
I mean, that's kind of the beginning of the machine guns, really, is
Yeah.
uh, I had challenged for these NWA junior heavyweight tag titles twice and lost both times. One time Spanky was my partner. One time Sanjay Dutt was my partner. And third time, the office said, "Who do you want as your partner?" And by this point, we're talking like, mid 2006. I had wrestled Saban probably more than anybody. And I thought, this guy's like the one who pushes me the most. He's the one I've trained with the most. He's the most similar to me in terms of size and speed and agility. I want him. And it wouldn't have happened had we not had all these singles matches together. So for me, it's kind of like a full circle moment.
Not you know that definitely it's one of those where I think it's one of those where the cliche it's going to be the sellout in the back, especially with how stacked that card is, how everyone is hungry in that card. They're just going to want to sit down and just learn from you two and just see what goes on this coming July. But I do want to acknowledge because we've had a stacked chat right now. I want to thank everyone that's been watching and just loving everything that Alex has to say, from the DWO guys to Gigi to Tyler to Matt Awesome to even Revolvers in the chat. Shout out to Smiley. Shout out to everyone that's been enjoying this conversation here. And before we start wrapping this up, I do have one more question I want to ask
Mhm.
that I feel like this is one that, just to pick your brain a bit, if there were one match that you would recommend for anyone that's looking to see what truly defines Alex Shelley, the performer, what match would that be?
Oh, Jesus. Um, I don't have a match that I particularly gravitate towards. But I can give you a quick anecdote about something that might be very different. And this is a match I get asked about, not infrequently. When I first went to Japan, I was brought over by Brian Kendrick, and he was a superstar there. I was doing my first tour, and it was a bit of a tryout situation. So we had our very first show at Cork and Hall, and super crazy. By that point, I gotten signed to WWE. So they put me in the main event. So my first match here is a TLC match, and it's myself and Masato Tanaka against Dick Togo and Sanjay Dutt. First match in this company, which Zero One was still a pretty notable company at this point. Main event, Cork and Hall. Okay, sell out, whatever. And I remember I did well in that match, but that's not really what I do. That's not really like the style of wrestling that I'm known for. At that point, I was known for technical wrestling. So we have our first Country Town House show, and everybody's warming up for the show. And the junior heavyweight booker, Kido Hidaka, asks Spanky to chain wrestle. And Spanky says, "I can, but Alex Shelley's pretty good if you want to do it with him." So I get in there, we chain wrestle for 45 minutes. And by the time I was done, Steve Carino, who was the booker for the Foreigners, came up afterwards. He said, "I think you just got yourself a job. Everybody surrounded the ring by the time you were done and just watched you guys." Like, okay, cool. So later that tour, Spanky and I were tag team partners, and we had to defend these tag team titles at the end of the tour. I was a fill-in for Kaz Hayashi. It's one of the losses I talked about earlier that led to the formation of the Machine Guns. So this was our last show before we defended the tag team titles. And I spoke with him and I said, "I'm not going to hit you, because if we're tag team partners, I don't want to hurt you. I just want to out wrestle you. I just want to beat you. I just want to prove I'm a better wrestler than you." Okay. So we went and we had this match, and I can't remember how long it went, maybe like 12 to 15 minutes. And we didn't strike each other once. It was all technical wrestling. And I remember doing it and thinking like, okay, that was cool. That was different. Over the years, though, people have come up to me and asked about that match multiple times. And I can't believe it gets lodged in their memories, but it seems to. And I think just because it's such a uniquely different match with that story behind it, that it sticks out as something that I approach differently from a mental and philosophical standpoint. And I guess if there's any story about me as a wrestler, or really probably as a human being, it's that I approach things from a very different mental and philosophical standpoint. So that's a match to at least take note of.
There you go. That's a perfect way to end it right there. Everyone, if you haven't already, which I imagine if you're watching this, you definitely have, make sure you are following this true legend right there on his social media, Instagram right there. Links will also be in the description down below. Follow him on X, Twitter, whatever you like to call it right there. And stay up to date with all things Alex Shelley. Again, this next matchup coming up next Saturday, as it will be defending that Revolver Heavyweight Championship against Speedball Mike Bailey. Mr. Shelley, thank you again so much for this conversation. Truly was a pleasure. And everyone watching, as always, don't forget to be wise, be genuine, be real, be better people, respect the craft. And we'll see